Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this month's Intro to Fundraising and Ask Me Anything event. My name is Jake O'Shea. I'm Capital Factory's Investor Relations Manager, where every day I work with founders in our Ventures program, helping them craft and execute their fundraising strategy for venture capital investors. I love this event because it gives us all a chance to do a deep dive with an investor together to better understand their thought process and hopefully help you be more successful in your own fundraising endeavors. Today, we're speaking with John Bronson, managing partner at J2 Ventures, a VC fund focused on dual-use technology. I'm specifically pretty excited about this conversation because, as many of you know, and if you don't know, Capital Factory actually works very closely with dual-use technologies and the government to help finance projects through our Center for Federal Innovation. In 2019, when we launched that Federal Innovation Initiative, our goal was to have 3 of our companies raise around $6 million in non-dilutive funding. And we had dozens of companies raise over $60 million total. Last year, that number was over $100 million. So lots of capital flowing to dual-use technology. So I'm excited to kind of dive deep and explore that a little bit more with John, who specifically focuses on this area. Before we jump in together, I've got a video from Capital Factory founder and CEO Josh Baer to share a little bit more about Capital Factory.
Capital Factory is the center of gravity for entrepreneurs in Texas. Thousands of entrepreneurs, programmers, and designers gather day and night, in person and online, for meetups, classes, and co-working. And with our team spread across the state in Austin, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, we meet all the best entrepreneurs in Texas and introduce them to the people that they need to meet most: investors, customers, and talent to grow their team. We watch all of this happen so that we have this unique insight into the market and use that to invest in all the best companies through our Texas Fund. And we've been the most active early stage investor in Texas since 2010.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that overview, Josh. Josh kind of touched on this, but one of our guiding principles here at Capital Factory for the past 6 years has been our Texas Startup Manifesto, which is really this idea that taken individually, it's really difficult for Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, even in Austin, to compete with, the Bay Areas and the New York cities of the world. But, all these cities are, a 3-hour drive away maximum. So if you treat Texas as one big unified market, right? So startups in Houston raising capital in Austin, hiring talent from San Antonio and working with corporations in Dallas. If you take us collectively, we're the 9th largest economy in the world and can go toe to toe with, anyone, including the Bay Area and New York City. So that's kind of the infrastructure and the ecosystem that we've been focused on building for the last 6 years. And it's really exciting to see it all kind of pay off with the Texas Fund and all the really, really great technology startups that we're working with from across the state of Texas. Now with that, I want to give some brief background on our speaker today, John Bronson. So John is the managing partner at J2 Ventures. Before co-founding J2, John was the director of acquisitions and finance at the private equity group of D.E. Shaw, which is a New York-based asset manager with over $50 billion in AUM. Before that, John was the chief operating officer at a startup, Backpack Health, and he began his career at Boston Consulting Group. He's got a Ph.D. in computational biology from the chemistry department at Columbia University, and he got his bachelor's from the University of Pennsylvania. So J2 Ventures, where John's managing partner, they invest in dual-use defense technology, and specifically they target areas where the U.S. is falling behind some of our competitors like China and Russia, and the government needs to spend and work with early-stage technology companies in order to compete. Their team has a really unique combination of defense, finance, and technology experience that really gives them a unique edge in helping companies navigate the government contracting process, from things called SBIRs, which we'll probably go into a little bit here, all the way to programs of record, which again, I think we're going to dive in deep here in a second. All the types of companies that are most interesting to John and J2 are companies using artificial intelligence, machine learning, companies leveraging advanced materials, and also health technology that soldiers and veterans and other government use cases can take advantage of. So with that, I'd like to invite John to the virtual stage. John, how's it going?
Good. Thank you so much, Jake.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I think to start things off, can you help define for the audience here like what a dual use technology is or what that means?
Of course. We think of dual use technologies as anything that has both a civilian application and a government application. I think if you go way back in the startup community, the best examples are the computer and the internet. Right? The computer was originally, or at least computer chips were originally used by the Air Force and NASA. Obviously, a major consumer application as well. And the internet was incubated by DARPA. So we really look for technologies that are going to be driving the next generation of the goods and services that we all care about, but maybe need a little bit more incubation than you can just get in the private sector.
Definitely. It makes me think of GPS. I think that's another one that was kind of incubated by government and obviously got me to the office today. So that's cool. So to start off, can you talk us or really like kind of walk us through the different types of government funding opportunities that are available specifically to some of these early stage tech startups?
Sure. And I think the best place to start is the SBIRs or SBIRs, depending on which part of the government you're referring to. There's a lot of information available on government websites on how to apply to SBIRs. But if you are if you're interested in creating a technology or in early stages of a technology that is of interest to the government, they can provide some early stage funding. It's a 3-stage process, so you can get on a phase 1, a phase 2, or a phase 3. You have to start with a phase 1, and then you can get progressively larger and more involved grants if your technology progresses. So any of you who are familiar with the academic world, it's very similar to the same type of government granting that takes place in academia.
Awesome.
And I should also add these are non-dilutive grants. So it's just cash for you to use to drive the growth of your business.
Yeah. And then correct me if I'm wrong, but at a certain phase of the SBIR program, do they provide matching funds to private investment as well?
So there are some programs that can do that. I think the main one that is best known is StratFi, which is part of the Air Force. But there are some other programs as well. The SBIR program is predominantly for individual grants, though. Okay.
And then, in my intro as well, I mentioned like program of record. What is a program of record and how do startups kind of get to that phase of working?
Yeah, so that program of record is the holy grail. That's the long-term large government contracts. If the government's going to buy an F-16, they're going to do it on a program of record. And so I would say if you are an early phase startup, if you're a seed or Series A, that's something you might want to work towards. But in the interim, the SBIR program is there to help provide the capital to develop the technology to get to the point where you do have a usable commercial product that can get on a program of record.
So it's kind of like a pathway to program of record.
Yeah, it's not unfortunately directly linear pathway, but it's the right place to start.
Okay. And traditionally, programs of record are big government contracting organizations, right? But that seems to be changing recently. Have you seen kind of a shift in the government's willingness to work towards earlier stage or less established companies?
Yeah. Right. So to your point, I think when people think of program of record, they think of the Boeings, the Lockheeds, these giant aircraft, or other just large industrials. But it's definitely true. We have seen relatively early phase Series B, Series C, tech-focused startups, software startups that are also getting on programs of record.
Awesome. So one thing that always comes up, it seems, when I'm working with some of these dual-use startups, is the difference between kind of government traction and commercial traction. Can you talk a little bit about how you compare traction with the government versus traction with a private company? Like, for example, is $1 million from the government for a pilot the same as $1 million from a corporation from an investor perspective?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what the nature of the contract is, and it's true on both sides, right? So on the private sector side, I think you see a lot of exploratory contracts where it's 50,000 to maybe say 200,000 in revenue, and it's because Ford or Google or Microsoft or Boeing just wants to take a look at a technology, and obviously it's great to have that. It's much better than not having it, but it's not the same thing as a validation of your product, right? It's just to take a look. And I think on the same is true on the government side, that if you're on a phase one and really even phase two, it's certainly a great signal. It's certainly great progress, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed to be progressing further than that, and that you've actually validated the technology in a commercial end user setting.
So not quite the holy grail of like recurring revenue that traditional investors love, huh?
Unfortunately, not at that phase. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges that that you see when investing in this space, is that, right, you may have $1 million or 2 million or even more of the non-recurring contracting revenue, and it can sometimes create a challenge and a disconnect, because if you are, as a startup, are thinking, I'm a $2 million a year revenue company, that's a very different valuation than I have $2 million of runway, of R&D runway, to build out my product to prove that there's a real commercial value there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. It's the distinction between financing the product and actually like purchasing and deploying the product. So you mentioned that's one of the kind of challenges. What are some of the advantages that you've seen as an investor being kind of focused on this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest advantage is the capital is non-dilutive, and it's based on creating things that the government wants, and the government frequently will forecast, right? So there are open topic SBIRs if you have a great idea that you think the government hasn't thought of. But in general, I think one of the challenges of many startups is that you're trying to find this product market fit, and so you're both trying to figure out what's the right product and what's the right market. Very frequently on the government side, the market's very clear. The government needs, there's a published list of what it is that they need, and so you can kind of de-risk that one aspect of the process. And you can use that as a springboard to create a more refined product to mature a little bit longer than maybe you would need to in a purely private sector setting.
Okay. So you mentioned kind of the open topic where, if you have technology that you think the government can use, you can apply through that. When the government is looking for a solution to a specific problem, how do they kind of share that with the public and basically solicit proposals where companies may be able to apply for that SBIR program?
So many SBIRs do have a clear topic in mind, and so you can just find various government agencies, just look on their websites, and the government's actually gone out of their way to try and make this process as transparent as possible. There are certain agencies or certain entities that will also sell services to help you get onto a phase one or a phase two. My belief and my partner's belief is the information that is publicly available is sufficient. My partner in his past life, was a reviewer of these things, and I've heard him comment that some people simply struggle to follow the rules that are laid out on the page, and that can be challenging. But if you do follow the rules, then you can get a fair shot at one of these grants.
Great. So in what ways is a VC fundraising strategy different when a company has some of this non-dilutive government funding or government traction? Do they need to have kind of a different strategy or a different way to think about valuation or valuation sensitivity? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think the big thing is it lets you take a little bit more R&D risk, right? Just you'll have, instead of saying, I'm buying 6 months of runway or 12 months of runway, you're putting in, enough financing for 6 months of runway and getting 12 months of runway, right? And so I think it's a really great tool for some of these riskier ventures, or at least technologically riskier ventures. I think the thing that we tend to be sensitive to is this a company that gets weighed down by the fact that they do have these non-dilutive grants, and are they still keeping an eye towards pushing towards commercialization? Because I think the one challenge of the SBIR program is, from an investor perspective, is it is actually possible to sustain a company for quite some time, largely on grants. And as you know, from an investor perspective, we're always looking for very rapid growth, and so there can be a little bit of a tension there, depending on the company.
That's an interesting point you bring up. I'm curious, what's kind of the optimal mix in terms of government versus commercial revenue that you look for when you're investing in a company? And I guess to start, like at the point of investment, and then also kind of like where you're looking for that company to grow into.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, it's less about the total dollars of revenue and more about what that revenue is telling us about the company. And so that goes back to, is this exploratory revenue? So on one extreme, right, revenue that is non-recurring or is just clearly exploratory in nature is just very different than a large pharmaceutical company gives you $100,000 grant in 2018 and then a $200,000 re-up in 2019 and $400,000 the next year. And so your total might not be a huge number, but that signal is very clear that there's an end buyer who is using that product, who is getting value and increasing that value.
Okay. So there's no specific breakdown. It's just what you're looking for is an indication that there is heavy commercialization opportunity there.
Yeah, it's unfortunately it's a little bit hard to. I wish I could give you there's a ratio. It's like 90-10 or something, but unfortunately, first just there's a wide a wide range of capital needs across industries, right? If you're a software startup, that's very different than if you're a material science startup. Mm-hmm. And so you just look for different types of grants in those different situations.
Awesome. So my last question here, and then we're going to jump into some audience questions. So guys in the audience, go ahead and start asking questions in the chat now. We'll bring them up to John. We've got a couple of audience questions ahead of time from your registration as well. But go ahead and start typing those out now. My last question is that, federal programs like SBIR, STTR, a lot of the different non-dilutive funding options can be pretty intimidating to navigate for founders if they don't have experience in the space. It almost sometimes seems like a different language with all the acronyms and all the different ways that you need to navigate it. I know I've felt that way a lot. What advice would you give to founders that see a clear government use case for their technology, but don't really have any experience or connections to the government or kind of working with the government?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A lot of the J2 value proposition is that we can help companies work with government and figure out what's the right pathway, whether it's SBIRs, whether it's OTs, which is another contracting mechanism. I think sometimes I talk about the government a little bit like the NBA salary cap or the NFL salary cap, where all of the rules are completely publicly available. Anybody who wants to can bother to learn them. But if you own a basketball team, it's probably better just to hire an expert who understands how the salary cap works rather than try and spend the time and effort yourself. And I think there's a little bit of that as well. And so if you are a company that is looking to dual use applications, that thinks that there's great opportunities to work with the government, I would encourage you to think about taking investors onto your cap table who are knowledgeable in that space and can help you navigate that process. And I think, in particular, investors as opposed to consultants, and obviously I'm biased as an investor, but one of the advantages of an investor in this space as opposed to a consultant to figure out the phase 3 contract or the OTA, whatever it is that your interests are better aligned. And so if over time you realize that something else is more appropriate, then we can work with you to figure out what's the right contracting mechanism that evolves over time.
Yeah, that financial alignment is really key. And I'm going to hog the mic a little bit. I have another question. What are some of the areas that you see that the government's super interested in now? What are kind of the biggest areas of opportunity that you're seeing or that you're getting excited about?
Yeah, there's a lot. And there's some areas that I think the government's very interested in that J2 is not as focused on, and there's some that we are more focused on. But I think very broadly, everything related to artificial intelligence and machine learning is important these days. Certainly, if you look at just the number of publications in the U.S. versus China and Russia, there's been a meaningful shift in the ratio of U.S. production versus production in China and Russia. There's a lot of interest in better materials, better energy sources, rare earth elements. There's certainly a push towards space. I think everyone's probably aware of that, and cybersecurity. Yeah, space is an interesting one. Cybersecurity is a very interesting one. And I think we're also seeing a lot more interest in healthcare, especially with respect to our veterans.
Okay, awesome. So now let's dive into audience questions. Guys, keep them coming. I see some great ones already. The first one is, we've got someone in FemTech in the audience. Is there an opportunity that you know of for kind of FemTech to get into dual use?
I think it depends on, FemTech?
FemTech, yeah. So like feminine technology.
Meaning like specifically for
well, yeah, like tech applied to like female health and wellness is the way that I've
got it. Oh, yeah. So certainly with respect to female tech health and wellness, absolutely. I think there are every year more and more veterans who are women, and as a result of that, there's the military is interested in providing healthcare for all of our troops, right, and all of our retired troops, and so very much so.
Yeah, that's one thing that's I've been happily surprised at in kind of learning about this space is that it's not just traditional defense technology of like missiles and drones and things like that, but the government has quite a few different things that they need help with. One of our companies that got an SBIR Phase 3 grant is a company called Carestarter, and they actually just help connect people with local childcare providers. So they're deploying their technology on military bases with military families. So it kind of really runs the gambit, and it's not just kind of that what you might traditionally think of as defense technology.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I would argue one step further, which is that the types of novel technologies that startups are best in a position to create are actually not the next generation of missiles or bullets. Established players exist and know how to do that. It really is the more innovative things, like you said, like better care on bases, what is going to be the next generation of batteries, things like that.
Awesome. Yeah, next generation of batteries. That's another interesting one. I've got a deal for you after this.
Sounds great.
So next question comes to us from Sam the Oil Man. Awesome name, Sam. Sam asks, if you already have a product in the private sector, can you still qualify for grants to apply the product to the government sector?
Yes, and it depends on the specific government program. So in general, yes, and we see a lot of companies that are selling to private and public. There are certain programs though that are designed specifically to overcome the valley of death and are targeted towards companies that are have established technologies but aren't actually at revenue. But I think that's probably a small percentage of the overall pie.
Yeah, awesome. So this next question comes to us from Clear Path Fitness. And they ask, as I've been told, as a sole proprietor with a small and relatively unknown team, SBIR would not be a good fit for me. Is there a path to governmental grants and funding for smaller shops?
So I think the SBIR program certainly at the phase 1, phase 2 level, we see companies that have 4, 5, 6 people who are able to navigate that contracting mechanism. Whether it's right for you and your business, I think the one area where I have seen companies struggle is if they are still really trying to figure out their product market fit and it's rapidly evolving, and then they find themselves in a situation where they have a grant to do X, but now the market's really telling them they want to do Y, and it's a little bit of a gray area of what you're supposed to do in that spot, right? Because you have money to do something that's a little bit more targeted, whereas when you have a traditional venture investor, you can have a board meeting and you can decide that you're going to pivot, and I think the mechanisms aren't as robustly developed on the government side there.
That makes sense. One thing I think might be helpful for the audience, and keep these questions coming, would be, and I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but so SBIR, you've got 3 phases, right? Phase 1, you're getting funding to basically prove that your technology can solve a specific problem. Phase 2, you're actually going out and kind of doing a pilot where you're using that technology to solve the problem. And then in phase 3, you're kind of expanding that contract and doing it a little bit more. Do I have that the right way? How would you kind of characterize the difference in the phases?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And then by the time you get to phase 3, you really have some opportunities to translate that into more of a contracting vehicle at that point. Mm-hmm. So I think of a phase 1 and a phase 2 as really more in the non-dilutive grant category. Phase 3 really transitioning you into that contracting process.
A legitimate contract, and then close to that holy grail of program of record, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah, awesome. So one question that we got from the audience ahead of this event is, what do startups need to prepare to convince investors to back a brand new move into new international markets?
Interesting question. And let me caveat that with, we are focused primarily on U.S. sales. So maybe less expert than others, but I think the broader, the broader theme of what does it take to convince an investor to do something new is very much the more that you have that purchase order, the more it de-risks things. So if you're already selling internationally, that's a great proof that you can sell internationally, not to overstate the obvious. I think the real challenge is to show that you understand the differences in the market and you can navigate whatever it is that's different, especially because many of the things that we're focused on, I think you're focused on in the Capital Factory, are in semi-regulated industries or regulated industries, which can be very different country to country.
Yeah, we focus on all tech, but definitely quite a bit of that too, just because of our relationships with the federal government and investors like you. Kind of a follow-up question on that. You mentioned you were focused kind of primarily on U.S. sales. Do you have any tricks to finding investors that are specifically interested in international expansion?
So I think there are plenty of investors who will say that that's part of their mandate or part of their focus is, they either have part of their funding from a certain country or they have a team in that country. So I think it's just a question of finding the right fit. And I would say even more broadly than that, as you look to take money, you should always be thinking about what is it that your investors can do for you. Because I think if you just want to take money, then SBIRs are great, right? Because you don't have to sell any of your company. Otherwise, you should be getting more than just the cash for what you're doing.
Definitely. And kind of on that note, in terms of like tricks for finding investors interested in international expansion, something that I've seen effective in the past is just focusing on investors that are in that new market that you're trying to enter. A lot of times they don't actually have the same level of deal flow as a lot of the US-based investment firms. So they're really excited when there's someone that wants to break into that market, particularly if it's a good investment opportunity for them. And then going back to your point about investors, kind of adding value beyond the capital, if they've, got established relationships in that area, in that market, they can obviously help a ton. That's something we've been able to leverage here at Capital Factory with companies that are interested in, leaving from where they're based at another country and kind of having a soft landing in the United States, or even within the United States, kind of coming in and immediately being able to plug into a network across the state of Texas. So it looks like we've got another question. One of the most important things that a startup needs to present to any investment group is a correct valuation of their company. I think I'm reading this correct. Yes. How do you avoid the trap of overinflating that valuation by placing too high expectations on the potential market value of the company's product or service?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's always an interesting dilemma, especially. I think there's a temptation to just say, what's the highest valuation I can get at any point, and just take that. And I think there are times where that's a legitimate argument that you can say, look, I believe that I can get additional runway, and that runway is going to be really valuable. The companies that I have seen, I think, manage this process the best are really thinking of their investors as partners, and looking to find partners who will help them grow, help them scale, but also as part of that partnership are really thoughtful about the act of that investment is what's going to be catalyzing some value. And so it's okay to take a little bit less money today because through that fundraising process, I'm going to make myself twice as valuable, 3 times as valuable, 5 times as valuable. And so, right, if my valuation is 10% lower, but I can make my company twice as valuable, right, the math kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And when I'm talking to founders about this, I always just advise them to kind of play out not just this fundraising round, but look at future financings too, right? Because if, if your investors want, kind of a valuation bump at each subsequent round of funding, right? And if you don't raise enough money to get to the level of bump that they want to see, then you put yourself in a tricky position where maybe you need to raise additional capital before you're at the place where you can kind of justify the valuation needed to raise that next round. So just think really long term, because to your point, this is not a zero sum game, and it goes long term, right? So maybe taking a little bit less of a valuation now will enable you to raise more in the future. And obviously, the goal is to continue growing that valuation. So another question here from ClearPath Fitness. Could you get into a little bit of the process of applying for a phase 1 SBIR? I guess just adding on to their question, is there like a central repository for this or a central database where companies can search for solicitations or opportunities?
Yeah, there are places you can search. I can send them out after this. I think the SBIR program kind of is an interesting background because the way that it's set up, actually, each government agency has the option to create their own version of the program. Right? So there's an Army SBIR, there's a Air Force SBIR. There in theory could be. I think other government agencies have decided that doesn't make sense for them, but in theory, any government agency can have their own. And so that creates advantages and disadvantages, right? Like there's the convenience of, hey, it would all just be one standard thing, but it also gives you some flexibility and freedom of maybe I don't fit in as well with one, but I do fit in with the other. And unfortunately, like everything else in the startup world, there's also just a little bit of you get rewarded for some hustle and chasing down different opportunities.
Yeah. And then kind of a follow-up there, do you have any kind of specific tips for navigating that application process?
I actually think it's fairly straightforward. Like I really do honestly believe that if you follow the instructions on the website, that you put yourself in a good spot to succeed. And I think where people struggle is that they get a little bit too creative on how they fill out these forms. And it's really important to be creative in the startup world, but this is not the place to express that creativity.
Yeah, the military is not known for being super creative.
I will say the overall programs themselves, I think, actually are quite innovative and really forward thinking. Certainly, if and when the United States develops real quantum computing, it will be for the forward thinkingness of the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, when you are filling out those forms, I cannot agree more.
Yeah, not the place to be creative. Awesome. So this other question, many startups' first raise is in the range of $1 million or less. When they get to the later stages and raising larger amounts of money, should a company do anything different? For example, when looking to raise $100 million compared to $1 million. And I think just to sum that down, how should a startup plan to raise funding and take on government grants as well? How should they kind of integrate that into the process? Any best practices, things like that?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that you have with government is that of timing, right? When if all goes well and you're raising in the private sector, in theory, you can raise in a couple of weeks or even less sometimes, right? And there's just a longer cycle in government, and so either you have to start very, very early when your team is small and your costs are incredibly low, or you need to think of it as something that will let you focus on R&D if you get it, but you shouldn't bet your entire runway on certain grants hitting. And so I think there's a little bit of a juggling act there that can create some challenges. I think more broadly, when you think about $1 million valuation versus $100 million valuation, the real difference is at $1 million valuation, people are betting on ideas, they're betting on teams, they're betting on inspiration. By $100 million valuation, hopefully you have some proof of revenue as well.
Yeah, they're betting on numbers at that point. A little bit less creative again. Awesome. Well, guys, if there's any other questions, please do leave them in the comments. A couple of programs I want to mention. If you're tuning into this, these are probably highly relevant to you. One would be Fed Supernova. That's our biannual event where we bring together government and industry and investors like John to basically create a whole bonanza of different people that are, working on dual use technologies. And so make a lot of connections and introductions that way. And the other program that we have coming up this fall is our SBIR cohort. So this is actually a program where we work directly with companies to help them move from one phase of the SBIR program to the next. So lots of great resources there. We help connect people with, corporate customers because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I believe past like phase 2, you actually need to have some commercial traction because the government's not interested in, investing in companies that are only, alive because of government financing. They want there to be commercial traction too. So we help a lot with that, help connecting to, the right resources for writing those proposals for later stages. And if you're interested in any of that, feel free to reach out to us here at Capital Factory. All right. Well, if there's no other questions in the chat, we're gonna, hop off here. Thanks everyone so much for tuning in. John, thank you so much for being here. I learned a lot. I hope everybody in the audience did too. I think this is, one of the most unrealized opportunities for startups today is just how much funding is out there and how many different types of, proposals the government's looking for. So I really hope that, you guys are the start of a trend of more investors looking seriously into this space because there really is so much opportunity here. And, being able to advance our country at the same time as make a lot of great money, is always a great thing. And here, I want to give you the chance to plug anything that you want to talk about or, give companies in the audience a way to connect with you if they're interested.
Thanks, Jake, and really, really great to be here. Couldn't agree more with what you've said. I think if you actually look at most of the companies in, say, the Fortune 100 and say how many of them actually at their core were originally dual-use companies, the overwhelming majority of them are, because again, so many of the most critical technologies that we use today, from computers, internet, blood transfusions, all the way down to things like duct tape and silly putty, right? They all were government
ballpoint pens, right? From
right. Right, or video games, right? These are all dual-use technologies, and so I think the government is in a position now where there's a strong belief that that dual use and startups are really a critical part of our future as a country, and I think that as a result, it's a great time to be a startup that's trying to take advantage of these types of non-dilutive capital or government sales. And we have a website, j2vp.com, if you want to reach out to us to learn more, and we're certainly happy to chat with any of you.
Yeah, and just for the audience, John and his partner Alex have been so helpful for us and the dual use companies that we work with, just plugging them into resources and being a resource themselves. So highly recommend reaching out to them if you're interested. Well, great. With that, John, thanks so much for being here. Audience, thanks so much for tuning in. This was a great session. And John, I'm going to send you that deal as soon as we get off here with the alternative energy storage. And audience, come back here same time next month. We're going to be doing another intro to fundraising AMA. So thanks all.
Thanks, Jake.